This is the Change Physician, episode 220. Kevin.
Hey, folks, welcome back to another episode of the Change Physician podcast. This is your host, Dr. Kevin Cuccaro, with my Amazeballs co-host, Dr. Melissa Cady, and our Amazeballs guest, who's a returning guest, Dr. Kelly Casperson. Dr. Casperson is a urologist who has become a sex expert over the course of her own podcast. This is a fantastic guest. We had an amazing interview with her that we invite you to go back and review. But for this one, we want to talk about her new book, which is You Are Not Broken. It was recently published, and it was a book that needed to be made. So Kelly, it's great to have you back on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So can you tell us, so I have your book, but I don't want to go into super details on can you kind of tell us what went into, why did you write this book? There's lots of different sex books out there, but why did you write this specific book, and kind of what was the reasons for that?
Yeah. Well, when you read enough books, you start figuring out like where the gap is. First you think like, well, it's all been done. Right. But then you're like, no, it hasn't. And I think there's like if I break it down, there's two different types of sex books out there. There's the like academic, I'm the PhD, let me tell you what my research says. It's very dry. It's written at a level that I think is not approachable for the average human. And it's actually quite dull. And then the second type of sex book is like, wear your stilettos, put on your fishnets, how to become a sexy fox after you've been working a 12-hour shift and like you feel like poop because you've never exercised. So like that's the two different types of sex books out there that I found. And I'm like, neither one of them is all that helpful for people. Because you're like, at the end of the day, I'm just myself. I'm not this like sexy fox in stilettos. And it seems like a lot of energy. And so what I really noticed is like, we have tons of great data out there. It's just not translated well for the average person. And so I wanted it to be a quick read, an easy read, an approachable read, but in a very empowering way of like, you don't have to change who you are to have the great sex in your life. You just might need to change your thoughts and your priorities, but you don't need to like go to a strip club and like figure out the shoes. So that was what the gap that was missing. And I think I nailed it.
I think you did a great job. As I said, so I was going to show the book and everything, but I have the Kindle version. I actually tried before we started recording, and it makes me go invisible because when I throw the screen and the camera doesn't process it, so I just disappear.
Right.
But I'm just going to go through some of the chapters on here. Society got it all wrong. The rules are ridiculous. Bad sex sucks. Sex positive sex ed for adults. And then I really enjoyed about this is there's definitely a female perspective, because I know when you're talking about on your podcast, You Are Not Broken. My suspicion it's a heavy female audience because there's a lot of shame when it comes to sex. I think for females, although there's males too, and we can talk about that. But I did appreciate that there was the male edition. There's a chapter on it for the men here. So, like what was your favorite part about writing this book?
I love all of the stuff where it's like, the evidence is so glaring and we just don't know it, right? Like desire discrepancy in a couple is normal. Like you just change people's lives by like normalizing their experience, right? Like these like huge truth bombs that are like so obvious, but everybody's so shameful about it. Like 70% of women won't have an orgasm with putting something in their vagina. Like glaring statistic, people don't know it. And then you tell a couple that and they're like, oh, well, yeah, okay, that makes sense. That's how we are. Right. And so it's like, it's really the big obvious things that like, I truly believe people just need a little bit of education. You give them a little bit of education and they do pretty darn well in the bedroom then. And they don't feel like isolated and shameful and like that they're the broken one. And, when you think about our sex education in this country or the world, it comes at a time like we're not adults. We don't know what adulting's like. We've never been in a long-term committed relationship. We like really need this adult sex ed to be like, hey, if we want to prioritize our intimacy, these are the things we need to know.
And that's a great point, because I'm trying to reflect back on my sex ed. And it wasn't sex ed. It was like mechanic ed in biology, right? Yeah. It was literally, here's your biological pieces that you've been carrying around for, I'm trying to remember when our first sex ed, I'm at least 12. And I remember thinking I probably needed this 6 years ago rather than what you're telling me now, because I kind of know this, at least the basic stuff. And then it's the mechanical kind of stuff. Like if you're, sex is the penis goes in this way and blah, blah, blah. And here's how you put a condom on a banana. But it really didn't talk about like sex as the act and the act of intimacy. And the first time I ever was exposed to sex ed that included that was, it was in a Michael Moore film, and he was talking about sex ed in France. And the clip that they showed was so different than what we get in the United States. They were actually talking about intimacy. They were actually talking about these things. I mean, what have you had feedback on it? Because again, I'm shocked that we don't talk about this in our country. I'm shocked that we don't approach this in any way. And I could see where this book would be an introduction for a lot of people to normal, quote unquote, normal intimacy and intimate expectations.
Totally. I mean, you're absolutely right. Like the education we get is more of a disease and pregnancy prevention plan, right? But like the majority of times that people have sex, it's not to create a baby. Average female in America has 1.7 children. So you've had sex 1.7 times if you had sex just to have a baby. So I think it's very intuitive to a lot of people of like, oh yeah, we have sex for other reasons. You know, and I joke about it in the book of like, teenagers aren't going around being like, I'd like to practice not getting pregnant and not getting an infection. Like they're not doing it for those reasons. They're doing it because it feels good, right? And I think we take this very like black and white slippery slope of like, if you tell people, let alone kids, if you tell them it feels good, society's just gonna crumble. Like, you know, it's like we can't tell them it's supposed to feel good because then like something horrific's gonna happen and they'll drop out of school and just have orgies. I have no idea. But like you get to the point where you have all these women more than men, but you get to the point where women are like, I don't know if I even like sex all that much because she was never told like, this is supposed to be pleasurable equally.
Mm-hmm.
Like literally never told that. So they're like, well, maybe I just don't like sex. And it's like, well, you might not like the sex you're having, right? But that doesn't mean that sex for you couldn't be pleasurable if you experimented a little bit.
Yeah. You know, I'm wondering, you know, I think about like when we did the episode before, or just the fact, I mean, how you've taken off in what you do and the amount of, just the number of people listening in, even if they're not like identifying themselves and just want to hear what's being said. I think it's just another, it just kind of edifies the fact that we are not getting the right education. We're not, people are so curious because we're so uninformed, or we've been let down by, like you just said, they're not enjoying it. Maybe they feel like they're less than. So I just think it definitely highlights the fact that we need this. But my question for you is, I know this is adult sex, but with this book, what's like the age you think people could start reading this?
Well, I think what this book lacks is that I don't talk about disease and pregnancy prevention in this book, right? So to me, it's like I kind of assume that there are some facts that you are going to get elsewhere. This is really geared more towards like, you're an adult, you're in a long-term relationship, your sex life isn't great, here you go. But I think if you reflect back and be like, hey, what if we did it right in the first place, right? What if we didn't have to, because we literally have to unlearn. That's what this book is. It's unlearning. It's you know, we say we didn't get an education. We got plenty of an education. It just didn't serve us, right? Let alone what Hollywood's telling us about sex. But so if we took this down, what would it look like? It would look like consent, right? It'd look like consent. It would look like prioritizing equal pleasure. And I think both of those things are lacking in a lot of adult monogamous long-term relationships. You know, the consent part's super fascinating and there's not a lot of research on it. We research college students because they're easy to research, but looking at this huge, I'd say it's millions of people who are like, yeah, fine, I'll just have sex because they want to. Right? It's not a hell yes. It's not even like a yes. It's kind of like, well, I'll do it so they don't get grumpy or because they need to, or that's what marriage is. And it's this gray zone of like, it's not rape, but it's not she's not into it. Like she's really not into it. She is doing it for other reasons besides pleasure and intimacy. And we don't have a lot of research. But the more I talk about that, people are like, that is huge. And we don't know anything about it. And I think it stems from like people thinking that like you just give sex because it was in the marriage vows. And it isn't a conversation of like, hey, let's have equal pleasure. Hey, can know me know? Can know me no in a long-term committed relationship? And I would say it should. It better mean no, because if it's never a no, how do you know it's a yes?
Yeah. You know, you bring up a really good point. And, you know, you talk about marriage. In my personal opinion is that this is happening even at the college age level, where women, whether they want the attention from the man, they don't know how to say no. I've always kind of, I hate to say, it's kind of probably a gender tendency of always saying yes and pleasing and all of that. What's your take on like what's going on there, even if it's not a marriage and you're just like, maybe you just met this person or you've only been on a couple dates and you feel kind of pressured and you just can't get yourself to say no.
Right. And I think it's, again, we don't get taught about consent on both sides. This is all genders are responsible for the horrific situation we're in. When you look at the college hookup culture that's happening, let alone the heavy amount of alcohol use that is used to get your consent down, right? And to make you not think about consequences. There's so much there. And if you look at the orgasm gap, heterosexual married, we've got 30% to 98% for male female orgasm. You put that into the college scenario, the female in hookup sex is having an orgasm 5% of the time. And so like she's really there performing for somebody else, where the male orgasm is the goal. And I have a friend who has a daughter in college, and the daughter is literally like, I just feel like I'm somebody's hole. And it's like, to hear a 22-year-old say that, and for us in our generation, we're like, oh, it's so much better now that we have like great educators, and it's like, I would not say that's better, because what we've done is we've kind of pushed sex into the very beginning of meeting somebody, right? It's almost expected of like, hey, are we gonna have sex tonight? Oh, I just literally just met you.
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
and we know.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
A lot of women, in order to feel comfortable to have an orgasm, need to feel connection, right? And so if you don't have that connection first, of course, her pleasure might wane, and especially if he is not prioritizing it.
Yeah. No, I was just say that there's another like layer of kind of what you're saying. Like if there's no, just even like what dating's for, and like how to determine a good partner, but learning how to connect and do things that bring you joy and satisfaction with someone other than sex, so that you don't put sex so much on the front. And I think if you even learn the physiological impact and the emotions tied in with that, and how it can complicate a situation that may not be healthy, and you find yourself having a hard time extricating yourself from that situation.
And that's one of the reasons I love your book. So I have two kids. My son is starting his second year in college. My daughter is starting her senior year. And I haven't, but I will be, because we have it on Kindle now, so they should all be able to have access to it. And I'm going to basically say, you need to read this book. And one of the reasons why is while there are, we talked about the kind of mechanic stuff, and then there is consent. But if you have awareness of an act that you are now taking ownership of, and you recognize that act is intimately involved with your own well-being, I think in some ways, then when we start moving into these consent, or we talk about whether or not to have sex, if someone actually understands that sex is a good thing for me too, then they're going to perhaps on a more subconscious level, at least be more choosy about how they proceed, rather than feeling like, well, I don't really understand this anyway, and society and expectations in the movie say this is what we do, so I'm just going to follow through with that. Yeah. So that's, I mean, that was one of the things I was looking at when I was reading your book. I was literally thinking, I want my kids to read this book, so that they feel comfortable about sexuality. Because I think when you are comfortable with sexuality, then you are in more control, and you certainly the power dynamic changes. Yeah, totally. And I think, again, it's, these young people, they're grown-ups, they're adults, they're at college, but it's like, to be desired for the female, and again, I'm being very stereotypical and heteronormative, but like, to be desired is like this great achievement, right? Like, that's where there's a lot of worth in us being desired. And it's like, okay, we're being desired to the point of we're giving the guy the sex he wants. And then besides being desired, what did we truly get out of that? Let alone if we got a negative out of it, right? Because sex is inherently risky. It's a risky sport. And so it's like to give them that education ahead of time, and to be like, listen, this is adult stuff. It's pretty complicated, versus, what are we doing? We're just giving them a bowl of condoms in the health center.
Unbelievable.
It is. It's fascinating.
I'm just curious from a mechanic standpoint, right in the book, was it fun? Did you find it like challenging? Did you need a lot of external
like,
support to get through it? Like I've been
like,
through
you
it, so
know,
I'm curious.
Yeah, it's personal growth, right? It's like
On
discipline.
steroids.
Yeah, it's discipline and you hating it. But I had enough like knowledge to be like, oh, I'm in the hating it phase. Okay, that's nice. So I almost was able to like watch myself do it. Like, oh, I'm in the loving it phase. That's nice. But I love talking, right? Podcast is my sport. And so for me to like put it down and to be like, oh, the first time you put something down on paper, it's not good. And even the pros are like, it's never good, right? And to like know that's how that genre works. Instead of like, hey, I'm pretty certain I could do an hour-long podcast and it rocks, you know. But so yeah, it's writing's very humbling for me.
Yeah.
People are like, when's the next one? And I'm like, oh God, no.
Well, and you
Don't do
wrote
that.
this though. You wrote this very similar to a podcast, right?
I did.
There was a tonality and the way that your verbiage use was such that it's very easy to consume because it is much more of a conversation rather than the typical book. And that's one of the things. Like, this is so easy to read.
Yeah, it's so easy to read, and it's not written for doctors.
Yeah.
Right. And like to be a physician, when you have that level of training, especially if you've done any sort of like research publications and stuff that they make you do, right, is like to be able to talk to the common person, right? Like I don't need to tell people how smart I am. I don't care at all. To me, I'm like, they just need to understand this in a way that's approachable. That's the goal. And like to be able to be like, I'm not writing an academic paper. Please don't make me. Like citing my sources. I hate citing my sources.
But you cited sources.
I cited I know, because I'm like, somebody might want to know these sources.
I appreciate that, because
I hate doing it.
Well, but I'll tell you, there's a lot of what I consider kind of lazy writing when people, because there's two ways. There are people do it and they make it so stringent and they make it so academic. But then there's people who go the other. There's a lot of personal development stuff and they just spout stuff. And I'm like, okay, well, is that true? Or are you just saying that? Right. I want to actually see a source. Yeah. And so you did this perfect balance of it's extraordinarily approachable, but you put sources in. So now I actually trust it even more. Yeah. I mean, I trust you, Kelly, but I mean, I love seeing sources.
No, I hear that. Like people are like 80% of blah, 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 and there's no source.
Yeah.
It comes to you in a dream. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think it's nice to validate. I mean, it's just there for those that are curious, or maybe they are like a professional that wants to be able to like back up what they're saying or you're saying that they learned from you. You know, and then there's some consumers out there that are, you know, they like to dig a little deeper. So I don't know. Sometimes it's just nice, instead of having like perfectly number them and everything, it's just like put them at the end of the chapter, just, you know, load them in the back and you go, you know, find it yourself. But yeah, that's nice that you did both. It's
good to have help too. Like to me, like if you wanted to torture me, you'd be like, number your sources, format them properly. Like, you gotta be like, uncle, like take my children. I don't want to do it. It's not fun. But yeah, you read enough books, you realize like there's so many different ways to do it. When we're taught, you know, in medical school and residency, there's one way to do everything. And you're like, no, that's not true.
So I also have to ask, what was your favorite chapter to write? I was gonna ask that. Well, I stole it from you.
That's good.
I love the mind work stuff. I really do. Of like, what do you think about sex? What does your partner think about sex? Did you ask them? Why not? I think the challenging chapter for me was, because people always want to know, like, how do you talk to your spouse? And it's challenging. Like, I've read all the stuff and I listened to all the things, and like for me to tell you how to communicate with your spouse, to me, that's a lot of pressure. Mm-hmm. So I didn't love that, because I'm like, I don't know how you guys communicate, right? But I can tell you what not to do. But I have no PhD in like marriage therapy, of like how you uniquely you should talk to your spouse. I don't know. So I thought that was a little challenging.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious, like, as far as, I know you're asking about the chapter there, Kevin, but I'm wondering, as far as the message, like the biggest message you hope people take away, or like one of the messages that's like your favorite to share with people, what would you say that is?
Hope. Like when I talk to people and they're like, you gave me hope. I'm like, yes, that's it. There's hope. Because this is such a heavy topic for people. It's heavy, it's shameful. And you think about like, it's really an identity shift, right? If you're like, hey, I want to be somebody who's like sexually empowered, loves having sex, is very open and free about it. That's literally an identity shift for people. And for them to have hope of like, oh, it takes some work, but like those are just humans who have good sex lives. They're not like superheroes or something. And I think a lot of people are looking for, because they don't understand it, they're looking for a really quick fix. You know, and for me to be like, dude, there's not like on Tuesday it's all going to be great, right? Like this is like personal growth and your life and communication and an aging body. Like this is complex stuff, but like it's okay. You can navigate it.
You mean there isn't some little pretty pink pill or pretty blue pill that someone can just take and it'll magically transform their sex lives?
Dude, get this. So Viagra's been around since 1997. Number one blockbuster drug for Pfizer ever. One of the only medications identifiable by the shape and color of its pill. Right? It's like, it's literally like a Coca-Cola branding, right? And literally this year in a urology publication, somebody finally was like, when are we going to start thinking about the people that the Viagra people are sleeping with? I'm like, well, that took 30 years. That's nice. Like most of these people are partnered, but like to only now be like, oh, maybe this guy who has not been sexually active and never pursued her all of a sudden can get these 3-hour-long erections. You've got a situation on your hands, right? Like, who's taking care of their partner? And so I saw that and I'm like, yes, this is a miracle pill. It does amazing things, but like we didn't prepare anybody for like the relationship ramifications. We just used to laugh when like the spouse would bring the Viagra back to the clinic and be like, no, thank you. But a lot of these, my assumption, I would love to see a study, but a lot of times, like, I don't think the guy's like communicating like, hey, I'm going to go get a 2-hour erection now. You better, is that cool? Right. And so when I have guys that come in, I'm like, does she want to, like, have you talked about this? Does she want to have, because she's perimenopausal or postmenopausal. Is she on vaginal estrogen? Have you asked her how she's feeling? And they're like, no. And I'm like, well, what's your plan with the Viagra then, dude? Like, have a plan. But yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. People don't talk about it.
Well, and that brings up the whole point of, again, the kind of the single-sidedness and the whole kind of skewed relationship we have with sex, where it's so male-centric. Like I think of, okay, you know, Viagra was produced, and all of a sudden every insurance plan in the nation seemed to be covering it, and yet people were fighting to get birth control pills when we were trying to get hormone therapy. Like, what's the difference there, other than the CEOs of the pharmaceutical companies and the insurance companies tended to be men? So it was it just blows my mind.
Well, I know, and it's like, who's asking for it, right? Are the spouses like, you know what's really missing in my relationship? A 2-hour-long erection. Like I said, no woman ever, especially now. Like, oh, now everybody knows that 70% of women don't have an orgasm by putting something in their vagina. So like when you like look at all, you're like, what are we doing with the Viagra so much, people?
Well, and the placebo studies you discussed in your book, just
gotta love them.
Yeah, it's because, what was it, 40% of men, if you give them placebo and they think it's Viagra, will end up having an erection as well.
Yeah.
So that comes down to awareness and desire again, and like these expectations. And wouldn't that be easier to actually discuss awareness and desire and sex and positive sex and not need a little blue pill?
Yeah, it's just confidence, right? Like here's a sugar pill and a placebo confidence, and you're like, okay, great. Thanks.
Now I'm going to have an erection.
Yeah, I know, it's amazing. And in the female studies for the Vyleesi and Pilvanserin, it was up to 50% placebo effect. Placebo's real. I mean, we know it's real.
Well, it is. I mean, I hate it when people hear the word placebo and assume that it means that nothing happened. It's like, no,
it's fake. No,
it's real. It is nothing. That all that is talking about is these expectancy effects when it comes to the brain and body relationship are absolutely profound. And all that placebo is telling us is that in a lot of situations is the major component, and not these little compounds that we want to pretend are the reason for it. So why don't we recognize that and then maximize that? So if Viagra does that, we can do it without Viagra. And then you can save some money on your monthly drug cost without any side effects, actually positive side effects instead of negative side effects.
Totally.
Yeah.
I'm curious, speaking of like, creams and the hormones and all these other things, do you, and I'm looking forward to reading your book in totality over my extended vacation. I'm excited about it, but I'm curious about the patients or the people you've heard their stories that maybe didn't think that, I guess they're perimenopausal or menopausal, that whether it's placebo or not, have you found that they had hope, not only because of some of the things you said, but maybe they didn't realize that there is some kind of little bit of supplementation that can help them feel better and enjoy it more? Have you had a ton of those stories?
All the time. I mean, what I see a lot, yes, I would say yes. And what I see a lot is I stopped having sex 7 years ago because it started to hurt. Like we need to move this needle a lot closer, right? Because it's like the relationship changes. The data says the relationship starts changing after you haven't had sex for 6 months. Right? Like that's a sexless marriage. Some people with Barry McCarthy will be like, get the therapist already at 6 months. And they're coming in being like 7 years, 8 years, I haven't had sex because it was painful. And that's when their genital urinary syndrome of menopause or vaginal atrophy started kicking in. Right? And so now it's like, you got to undo all of that. You got to undo the pain connection, as you guys know, right? You got this brain pain connection. We
Anticipation,
anticipatory, muscle tension, like all that stuff. So to me, I'm like, we got to move this needle. And I think a lot of it in what I've learned is like, what do you think menopause is, right? If I put up a picture and I was like, pick the picture of the woman in menopause, you're going to pick a 75-year-old. You think these are like really old people with gray hairs and, walkers. And it's like, it's 50. It's 50, people. That's average age of menopause. That's what menopause is. And our menopause education is so crappy that a lot of women think, oh, I never went through menopause. Like, I didn't really have hot flashes, so I never went through menopause. It's like, they don't even know what it is. So my point is to get to the point of like, did you know that pain with sex is a menopause symptom and that it's easily curable by a pretty inexpensive skincare regime? They're like, oh my God, really? It's like
all these years.
Nobody told me this. Like they felt like something was wrong with them. And it's like, well, no, this is 50 to 80% of people who go through menopause. And everybody goes through menopause if you live long enough. Everybody who has ovaries. Yeah.
And you think about the ramifications on a relationship too. They start just kind of retreating or withdrawing. And the interpretation by the partner and them not wanting to talk about it or avoidance. I mean, there's got to be a lot of complicated situations.
Yeah. What I've been looking for, and I haven't found this, but I can't cite my source, so it's driving me nuts. But what I've, like the two biggest reasons that people end up divorced or break up is financial is a big reason that people have arguments and break up, and then intimacy. And I think when they stop being intimate, especially heterosexuals who have one definition of sex, which is putting something hard that he has into her vagina, it's so narrow that there's no room for error when either one of those body parts starts failing, right? And then we lose all intimacy. We don't go to bed at the same time because heaven forbid, we confront that problem. We stop holding hands. We don't sit together on the couch. We stop talking about our hopes and dreams. Now we're roommates. It's time for somebody else.
Yeah.
But to me, I can't cite the data on it, but I think lack of intimacy is a big reason, because you're like, where's your connection with this person? How is it different than everybody else in the world? Right? You're not intimate with them anymore.
Yeah. That's powerful. I mean, that has deep impact just from all those things you said.
Yeah.
Well, I'm very glad you had written that book. Where can people find it?
Amazon's the biggest one.
Yeah.
I just did the audio book. I just recorded the audio book this month. So probably a couple more months for the audio book.
With your voice?
My
voice.
You
did it.
Oh,
I love it.
Yeah. They were like, we'll have a professional. And I'm like, I have a podcast. It's going to be voice. Like, it's my voice. And the book is my voice. And I'm like, especially it's about such a sensitive topic too, of like, oh my God, if I had to listen to somebody who like was at all uncomfortable with it or didn't get the humor right, or I'm like, I have to read this book. Plus my podcast people would be like, come on. It has to be your voice. So they let me do it.
Love it.
which was
That'll be
fun.
cool. I might
funny
just
thing-
have to buy that just because I like hearing you talk and I want to hear
Yeah.
you read it.
Yeah, I
Because I
want the
heard your
audio.
voice reading this thing. I'm like, oh, he totally
Yeah,
sounds like
It's
you.
totally me. The funniest thing with the audiobook is they send you like all the corrections, you know, afterwards, and they're like, correct all these things. They like wanted me to redo every time I said Viagra, which I'm like, I'm a urologist. How should I be saying Viagra? And I think, however I say Viagra is the right way to say Viagra. So I'm like, I will not be re-recording these 32 times I said Viagra in this book.
That's
Awesome.
crazy.